to speak for a few minutes to get their broad thoughts on Russia's response to the outbreak. I'll then ask them a few questions before opening things up to questions from the audience. 2, to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. 3, you'll also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for any technical or other logistical issues, but if you can't see the Q&A button, you can insert questions there as well. And 4th and finally, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and in the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. Welcome to The World Today, a program at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these times. I'm Michael Horowitz, the director of Perry Worldhouse and a professor of political science. Today's guests are Evgenia Albatz, Trudy Rubin, and Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. Ms. Albatz is a Russian investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. Since 2007, she's been the political editor and then editor-chief and CEO of The New Times, a Moscow-based Russian-language independent political weekly. She was also, in 2017, the inaugural writer-in-residence at Perry Worldhouse and Kelly Writers House. Trudy Rubin is currently a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse and the foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. In 2019, Ms. Rubin received the Overseas Press Club of America's Flora Lewis Award for Best Commentary on International Affairs. In 2001 and 2017, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary. Last but not least is Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. He is the Woke Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Perry Worldhouse and a Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security. He was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016, the first American to hold that position. A career diplomat since 1977, he was also U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2001 to 2005. Thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse. And the floor is yours to give us some introductory thoughts about Russia's response to the pandemic and how it's shaping the world. To start, why don't we go in alphabetical order? So Evgenia, you're up first, followed by Trudy, and then Sandy.
Michael, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm glad to take part and honored to take part in the Perry Worldhouse event. And you know, I have just great memories about University of Pennsylvania in general and Perry Worldhouse first and foremost. Thank you very much for inviting me for this event. I'm not sure I understand your title, From Russia with Gloves. Trust me, you know, Russia in general is not that bad. We have very bad people who are sitting in Kremlin, and I share these with many American commentators. They're, you know, they're disgusted about my own government. However, Russians in general, you know, they're more or less decent people, you know, just so it's possible to touch us without gloves. We are not really that much endemic. Talking about Russia's response to COVID-19, I would say that its first response was in a pure KGB fashion, denial, and blaming others. And the first response was, and it was aired on Russian state-owned TV channels, that SARS-CoV-2 was developed by Pentagon in the United States in order to kill Chinese, because Chinese are the biggest American competitors. And therefore, this virus does not kill Russians. That was the first line of defense. The second line of defense also aired on Russian propaganda TV, and nothing but propaganda TV existed in the current Russian airspace, except for Echo Moskvy broadcasting. So the second line was that it is very weak virus. There is nothing to be afraid of. And so if you, you should choose the usual Russian protection that all of us were advised during the Soviet times. It is garlic. Garlic is the best line of defense against this virus. As of now, there are almost 156,000 Russians infected, and approximately 1,500 dead. Russians are lying on both counts. There are much more infected and there are much more dead. How do we know this? We know this because some independent websites like the New Times were getting information from Russian provinces where doctors and nurses are forced to say that exploited person died not out of COVID, but because he had cardiovascular disease. In the city of Perm, there was another case when doctors got infected, and however, they were told by their superiors to keep their mouth shut because otherwise their hospital was to get closed and all of them they were to find themselves without jobs. So in a pure Soviet fashion, governors know that it's better to report good news to Putin as opposed to bad news. Therefore, as just lately, last Tuesday, Putin said that those governors who badly prepared for the epidemic will be punished, and not just with administrative measures. Not just administrative measures means they will go to jail. Therefore, governors of each and every Russian region, probably with the exception of Moscow, is trying to keep their mouth shut and not to release the real data about the situation with the pandemic in my country. Of course, Moscow, as the most dense populated city in Russia, hit the most. Mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin, was the one who insisted on shelter-in-place policy, because many others insisted either to reduce martial law and to bring army to Moscow the way it was done in Wuhan in China. And still others thought that it was better to pursue the policy that was chosen by Belarus and by Sweden in Europe, that is, no shelter in place, let us get herd immunity. Thanks God, Sobyanin was smarter than both sides, so Moscow City is having this shelter-in-place policy. However, the problem is the following. Whereas German government gave almost 30% of GDP to support its citizens and its businesses. United States over about 12% of GDP. Russian government turned out to be greedy as always, therefore just 6% of GDP was given to support some corporations, and a lot of Russians, they are just lacking money for food. So I expect protests to happen pretty soon, and I'm really sorry for those in the Russian provinces who are suffering without good medical support and without food on their table right now. I probably will stop here, and I will be happy to answer your questions further down the discussion.
Thank you, Trudy. The floor is yours.
Yes. So just a few words on whether coronavirus is exacerbating Russia's already active attempt to stoke tensions before the elections. Of course, there was already a lot of information coming out about Russia's intention to do that anyway, before coronavirus became an issue. As you'll recall, in February, there was an intelligence agency briefing, a classified briefing to the House Intelligence Agency that told lawmakers that Russia wanted to see Trump elected in their analysis. And that led to the firing of the acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, because it was his deputy who did the briefing. And then the New York Times reported in March that intelligence agencies had concluded that Russia was trying to stoke racial tensions before the election. And in April, the Senate Intelligence Committee finally finished its 3-year review and unanimously found assessed that Russia had attempted to undermine American democracy in the 2016 election, in case anyone still doubted it. But then comes the question of whether COVID-19 presents new opportunities. Now, it's interesting, Putin has a history of promoting false information on health issues connected with the United States, including flu, Ebola, and now coronavirus. There were efforts by Russian intelligence to cast AIDS as a US military weapon. And H1N1, there was a story spread that it had been bioengineered at Fort Detrick. So it's not surprising that the State Department Global Engagement Center, which tracks this kind of disinformation, told the Senate hearing in early March that Moscow was already engaged in disinformation with proxy websites and official state media and setting up false personas online to basically to raise a level of confusion and division in US society. As Evgenia mentioned, the initial public effort on Russian television domestically and RT abroad was to hint that the blame lay with the United States on Russian domestic television. It was actually claimed that it was, as Zhenya said, a bioweapon aimed at the Chinese. And overseas, the effort was to show US incompetence in dealing with the crisis and Russian competence. Of course, in the early weeks until early March, there were very few cases supposedly in Russia. And so the Russians made a big deal out of sending a plane load of medical equipment to New York, which nobody praised except President Trump. And it was depicted in Russian media at home as the great gift in comparison with the days back in the 1990s when America was sending help to Russia, and now poor America was getting help from Russia. The same effort was also made with Italy, where some plane loads of equipment were sent, and a lot of it was defective, and the Italian press dumped all over it, except for a few outlets that were pro-Russian. So that didn't succeed very well. Zhenya has talked about the situation at home in Russia. I would just mention a couple of things. Obviously, Russians remember Chernobyl, a great deal of suspicion about Russian numbers, which at the beginning seemed very unrealistic. There was reportedly a spike in pneumonia deaths in Russia of 37% more cases than a year ago. A lot of suspicion that those were really coronavirus deaths. Also, Russian testing has been very unreliable, a lot of false negatives. So it's very hard to know, of course, what the real figures are. But something that I found very interesting, which is that state-owned polling in March showed that the share of Russians who would trust Putin with solving important state problems fell in March 2020 to 28.3%, which is the lowest in 14 years. And a Levada poll, the only sort of independent pollster, before the current spike in the last couple of weeks in Russian cases, showed that 48% disapproved of Putin's handling of the outbreak, compared to only 45% who distrusted governors' handling of it. Putin has handed off to governors, just like someone we know in the United States. So what we have is a lot of denial until now, a lot of uncertainty about Russian numbers, but reality has hit with the cancellation of the big May Day military parade that Xi Jinping was supposed to attend. And of course, now the Russian prime minister is out sick with coronavirus. So I think the issue of whether Russia can play this abroad in its efforts to meddle is undercut by the fact that Putin is not performing well in handling the crisis. I'll stop there.
Sandy, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. My old friends Trudy Rubin and Eugenia Albatz, from whom I've learned a lot over the years, and they've both covered a fair amount of ground already. But let me try to offer a few other comments. Clearly, the crisis has reached proportions which Putin certainly didn't expect. And with the rise in the caseload and the increasing impact on Russian society, this is looking more and more like a crisis that could actually begin to shake some of the foundations of the Russian system and the Putin system. Even though Putin entered this year in a much more optimistic frame of mind, things have not played out as he anticipated. Trudy alluded to the sort of similarities between how Putin initially responded and how President Trump did. I find a lot of the comparisons quite striking as well. Like Trump, Putin took some early steps, including closing the border with China, but otherwise was, as the others have said, inclined to downplay the threat, try to shift the blame to others. And in fact, in some ways, he tried to use the pandemic as an opportunity to break out of his international isolation and to consolidate his power for the long term. I think he very much reacted in this sort of celebratory context where 2020 began, as he was preparing for these two historic celebrations, the 75th anniversary of the Soviet/Russian victory over Nazi Germany, which Putin has basically turned into the defining event in modern Russian history. And at the same time, these constitutional amendments, which he's rammed through without any serious resistance, that not only strengthen the Russian state, but of course, create the basis for Putin to prolong his rule till as late as the year 2036. And who knows, he may be immortal, he might go on forever. And of course, as Trudy just mentioned, he tried to further boost Russia's prestige as having become great again by hyping this humanitarian aid that was sent to Italy, to Serbia, and even to the United States, which he used in Russian propaganda to prove the strength of the Russian authoritarian system in dealing with these kinds of global challenges in comparison to the floundering United States and the European countries. Now, this is all, of course, turned into a total house of cards, and it's now collapsed. The Russian population is becoming increasingly affected by the pandemic. It turns out that there was a lot of falsification of the numbers, surprise, surprise, at the early stages of the crisis. Many deaths were falsely characterized as pneumonia. Russia's decrepit healthcare system is increasingly stretched to its limit. There's even shortages now in some of the emergency supplies that were shipped with such great fanfare to the United States and to other recipients. Of course, Putin has had no choice but to postpone the May 9th parade and delay the constitutional referendum, originally scheduled for April 22nd. While he's delegated a lot of responsibility to regional governors, as has been pointed out, which is partly a way of ducking responsibility, I think that strategy may be increasingly becoming more and more threadbare. He looks increasingly detached from reality, and it's showing in the declining poll numbers that the others have mentioned. I was struck by the metaphor the New York Times used to describe him as looking more like a bored monarch hiding out in one of Stalin's old dachas rather than the man of action that Putin has tried to portray himself since he took power. So it's clearly a increasingly losing situation for Putin. He doesn't seem to really know what to do. Some people have speculated that he might try to divert attention from the coronavirus crisis by manufacturing some kind of international crisis, such as some new flare-up of hostilities in eastern Ukraine, or another incident in the Black Sea, like we saw at the end of 2018 when he kidnapped a bunch of Ukrainian sailors, or another new bombing campaign in northern Syria. We certainly have to be vigilant for those kinds of scenarios. But I think it's also a reality that the Russian people are almost as tired as Americans of endless wars. And this crisis, I think, is a reminder to them that the Putin system has been designed to maximize the wealth of the elites, but has not done a damn thing for the standard of living and the well-being of Russian citizens. And I think he may now realize that his political fate may turn much more on his ability to actually manage this crisis, even in a half-decent way, than in trying to whip up the kind of patriotism that proved so successful at the time of the annexation of Crimea. I think the West has to stay vigilant. We have to make sure that Russia doesn't think that we're distracted and not paying attention, and give him some new openings. We certainly have to work with our European allies to maintain solidarity on sanctions. Putin's hoping that there could be some kind of humanitarian truce that could ease some of the Ukraine and other sanctions. He needs to understand that on some issues of principle, the West still has some backbone. Anyway, I'll stop there. We very much agree with what the other speakers have said, and I look forward to responding to your questions, Mike, and to those of the audience.
Well, sure. Well, let me start with something. Those are great opening remarks, and let me start with something that was, something I was thinking about beforehand that all of you have some expertise in, and that some people in the Q&A have already touched on. And Sandy, your answer. Why don't we can start with you in answering the one way to think about this might be, it sort of doesn't matter how badly Russia botches the response to COVID because Putin's entrenched in power regardless. Another way of thinking about it might be that Russia's actually closer to instability than we might sort of know in the West, and so there would be real cost to him if the outbreak continues to accelerate in Russia. Which of those do you think is right?
Well, I defer to Zhenya, who knows the Russian internal scene much better than I do. But I think this crisis has the potential to be much more damaging to Putin than anything he's had to deal with in his 20 years in power. And of course, he's facing multiple crises at the same time, which, poor guy had bad luck to have a collapse of the international oil price at the same time as Russia faces this epic pandemic at home after optimizing its health system to the point that it can barely cope. So we've always said that Putin ultimately is kept in power by the elites, by the crony capitalists whose nest he feathers. But at some point, the Russian public can reach the breaking point. And I think this is what Putin fears most, is popular protests. This is what freaked him out back in Georgia and Ukraine in the Rose Revolution and the Orange Revolution. He was quite shaken by the protests that greeted his return to the presidency in 2011, 2012. If this begins to move from just sort of a lot of grumbling and complaining on the internet and in social media to something that leads to significant street protests, then this could become a challenge to the long-term stability of the Putin regime. We're already hearing that some of the polls that have been mentioned show that support for the constitutional amendments is by no means a sure thing, although they will always falsify the counting of the votes. So we don't think those are going to literally lose. But there may be one of those kind of moments in Russian history when the public opinion, historically more passive than in countries like Ukraine, may reach the breaking point. But I'd be very interested in Zhenya's view on whether this time could be different or whether it's just the same.
Yeah, please, Evgenia, and then Trudy, to jump in. I'm curious what both of you think from your perspective.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for passing to me this question. I tend to agree with you. I think that Putin looks very weak. His numbers on different polls, not just independent Levada Center, showed that his popularity rating is going down the hill. It's a trend now. It's not just one time bad numbers, but now we see it's a trend. But the government poll stuff, COM, also showed numbers below 30% approval rating for Putin lately. So it is to say that the situation with his ratings are pretty bad. However, and I do think that we should expect a period of instability in Russia, that people, especially in the provinces, won't be able to tolerate all this burden of health crisis, economic crisis, and et cetera, et cetera. However, the most important is the situation with the Russian elites, because the first will be the split of the elites. And that will be, I would think, the biggest danger to Putin. And we clearly see that even those loyalists, even those who tended to be quite loyal to Putin, they are no longer behave as such. They allow themselves to publicly criticize him. It's just the very beginning. It's very difficult to make predictions, but still I think that that there are a lot of uneasiness among Russian oligarchs and among Russian wealthy elite who see that Putin doesn't want to spend $1 to help Russian businesses, even though Russia has huge hard currency reserves, $500 billion in hard currency reserves, as well as she has some bad luck fund, as we call it, So also there are trillions of rubles in this fund that government is not in a rush to spend. So a lot of businesses are not going to survive this crisis. Small businesses, middle-sized businesses, they're going to probably to die, and they don't see any help from the side of the government. However, even ordinary folks, those who are those who were and still are Putin's core constituency, they're not receiving any help from the side of the government either. Pensioners, people in the provinces, and etc. So yes, I think it can be a real huge blow to the regime. Another question that I wouldn't be too optimistic about that, even though I'm all in favor change of the regime, because 20 years it's really difficult to hope for any change in my country. Still, I think we should understand that those who will come up, the first change will be probably pretty bad. The people who will come after Putin, these will be the hardline KGB guys. So, and Russia should expect worse before it will go any better, just to be on the realistic side.
Trudy, do you want to jump in on this one, or I have a question for you actually, if you'd rather not.
Let me just jump in for a minute. I think so much depends on two factors in particular. I mean, one, since we don't really know how legitimate the figures are, and since there's this very long border with China, even though it was supposedly closed, you know, what's happening in truth out in the Far East in terms of numbers, who knows? And, you know, one figure that fascinated me is that the Moscow mayor, Sobyanin, said Saturday that he thought that the number infected in Moscow is actually 4 times the numbers of officially confirmed cases. So that would be more than 250,000 people. So obviously one big issue is how serious is the virus in Russia? And are we only seeing it take off? In which case there won't be enough medical equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Connected with that is this question of whether Putin is going to spend any money. He does have these huge reserves, and he clearly does not want to spend them to alleviate people who are out of work due to the virus, because he understands he's going to need to spend them because oil prices are so far, far below the break-even point for the Russian economy. The economy is going to contract. And the question is, how long will those reserves last if oil prices stay very low, which they're likely to do because demand is going to be low even as economies begin to come back. So, you know, he could be hit by a double whammy, you know, fear of evaporating those large resources, but they could go quickly if oil prices stay really low for this long. It's $42, I think, is the break-even point. And prices are not even half that much. So I think he's caught between a rock and a hard place, and it'll be interesting to see if he's forced to start spending that money soon. I'll stop there.
So I want to turn now to some some of the questions from the chat and the Q&A, and one really interesting one that I think all of you will have some thoughts about is do we think Russia is influencing others in its sphere of influence? Thinking, you know, about principally but not exclusively about former Soviet states and how these countries handle COVID-19 preparation, response, treatment, you know, et cetera. Thinking about, say, like Turkmenistan and Tajikistan not reporting any cases, you know, that sort of thing. You know, how is Russia influencing its near abroad? I know who, if somebody wants to jump in first.
Just today there was, you know, I just briefly, let me mention that just today there was a long interview by supposedly the last dictator of Europe, Alexander Lukashenko, the leader of the Russian neighboring country, Belarus, who is in charge of the country for the last 25 years. He was very critical about Russia and Putin. Belarus chose totally different path. Belarus decided not to declare shelter in place. And we should say that the density of population in Belarus is much lower than in Russia. So that's probably important thing to say. As for, you know, obviously Ukraine, you know, it's an enemy state to Russia. As for Central Asian countries, I think they're much more influenced now by China rather than by Russia. Also, I think that it's important to point out that Yunnan province is in the south of China, and Russia has a long border. It's true that Russia has a long border with China, but with northern China, not with you know, places where there was outbreak of COVID-19 are pretty far from the Russian east. However, and I think that there is another thing that important to point out is that we see that in authoritarian countries, the mortality rate is always lower than in democracies. It is to say that democratic governments tend to be much more accountable in the situation of crisis rather than authoritarian ones. If you look at the kind of numbers that Philippines shows, or Indonesia shows, or Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, you will see the same situation as the one in Russia. Russian mortality rate, according to official numbers, is less than 1%. In Germany, which is the country in Europe which dealt the best with the pandemic, because it started much earlier than anyone else. They started in mid-January, and they created tests by the 3rd week of February. So the mortality rate in Germany is slightly over 4%. It's just impossible that Russia has a mortality rate less than 1%. Now, Putin is trying, by providing all this, all this humanitarian aid to different countries, to Italy first and foremost, and then also to the United States. I think Putin was trying to play into the cards of Eurosceptics, in the cards of those who would like to see European Union to get dissolved. At the beginning, there was a problem at the beginning of pandemic when Italy asked European Union for help, Germany first and foremost, and got none help from the European Union and from Germany. The situation changed somewhat in the later months. Some patients were taken from Germany and from France, from Italy and from France were taken to German hospitals. However, it is true that that Brussels was pretty much silent during this disaster that was going on in Europe. You know that Italy, France, Spain, Netherlands got hit very, very badly by the pandemic. So I think that what Putin will try to do, he will try to hit the European Union, the whole idea of this Europe unity. He has been aiming at that before the pandemic, and he will try to use the current situation in order to pronounce EU null and void. That's what I think is the biggest danger in Europe.
Sandy?
I just briefly, I know there's a lot of other questions. I agree with that basic point that discrediting the European Union and weakening and dividing the European Union remains his strategic objective. I just think one interesting sidelight to this whole crisis has been that it shows the complete irrelevance of some of these Russian integration projects in the former Soviet space. Putin has, it's basically been every country for himself. Russia has not provided any help to the Central Asians, as far as I know, or to countries like Armenia. Lukashenko is off in his own world, in total denial of the existence of the virus, much less its danger. But I think that some of these weaker Central Asian countries may have been hoping that the Eurasian Economic Union and the various trade pacts that they have would be a basis for some preferential help from Russia. But I think they realized that these are all just political projects for Russia. There's no serious sense of solidarity of the kind that I think Europe is beginning to show after initially scrambling with this crisis. I think you're seeing the Europeans come together in a way that is heartening, and I think gives the lie to Russian propaganda that democracies are incapable of coping with these kinds of crises.
Trudy?
One of the things that fascinates me, I don't know if this is where we're going, but it is how this crisis is underlining how much Russia is a very junior partner to China in its supposed alliance with Beijing, because Russia is selling oil like crazy to China where it can't sell in the other direction because there's a glut, and China is buying up cheap Russian oil to stockpile. But, I'm sure that the Central Asian countries are looking to China and the Belt and Road Initiative for any cash inflow they're going to get. And I don't know the facts on this, but if they get aid, I would imagine it would be more likely to be from China than from Russia.
So what do you think is going to be the effect of this on the relationship between China and Russia? Some people have asked about that, and in the context of Belt and Road in the Q&A.
Well, I think it just underlines that Russia has nukes, and that puts it in a position to play games with the United States. It's not going to use those nukes in a game with China. And when it comes to economics, Russia is nothing. Russia is a total junior partner and more dependent on China than people understood. I think in the beginning, when there were pipelines for Russian energy to China, there was some thinking expressed, in commentary that this would make China beholden to Russia. No, it's the other way around. And I think this is very clear to China in this crisis, because China now considers itself, how true it is, we can't know for sure, we'll see, but basically out of the woods, even though it's going to go through economic shocks in the coming months. But Russia is just heading into the worst of its crisis with a huge contraction in its GNP, and it is totally dependent on energy exports, whereas China, as we all know, is China, and it is not. And so I think this just underlines how unequal that partnership is, but how Russia still needs China more than China needs Russia.
I would say that it depends, truly, to be honest with you. I think it depends upon what kind of policy the United States is going to choose with respect to China. If the United States with European countries will announce sanctions against China, as Trump just recently suggested he might do, that there will be some actions taken against China, then Putin will try to play a role of mediator. I think that the whole idea of China Wuhan lab as the source of SARS-CoV-2, to be honest with you, I think that it was Putin who brought it to Trump, because that's the hypothesis that was circulated in Russian elite circles the entire January and February, and they almost openly were talking about this. Then all of a sudden, Russians stopped talking about COVID coming out of Wuhan lab, but Putin was 4 times on the phone with Trump, and after that, following that week when there were 4 interactions between US president and the Russian president, United States president started talking about China lab in Wuhan as a source of this pandemic. Now, for those who may be not following these events as closely as 4 of us do, I should say that I spoke to specialists in this country. There are plenty of Russian best minds in that field who are working now for FDA, CDC, and best American universities. And each and everyone told me that they absolutely aware that this virus wasn't man-made and wasn't modified. It is too difficult to do that. However, of course, no one can define whether it came because somebody was lazy in Wuhan or not. On the other hand, we do know that American scientists did work in this lab as well. And according to New York Times, United States financed this lab in Wuhan along with the Chinese. So it's getting to be a very interesting story. But to cut the long story short, I would say that if United States, along with its European allies, decide to go with sanctions against China, then Putin gets a playing field. He gets a possibility to play as a mediator. And he will choose to do this, I think. You don't think so? We know that at the very beginning of the pandemic, Putin addressed the Security Council of the United Nations, trying to force Americans to abandon sanctions and economic sanctions that were imposed after annexation of Crimea, and then Russia's involvement in the war in eastern Ukraine badly hurt Russian businesses and state-affiliated businesses first and foremost, if for nothing else, but because Russia is in bad need of cheap Western money. And these sanctions precluded Russian businesses from borrowing in the West. So it was a real serious, and it is a real serious situation for Russian economy. So I think that Putin will try to gamble again and play in between China and the United States and see who is going to be better to him. Trudy, I'm curious what will be.
I don't see that, but maybe that's taking us in a direction that's away from where people are asking. I mean, I think, first there has to be evidence that the Wuhan lab produced the virus in some way. And without that, the Europeans aren't going to come along. And secondly, this is a political issue aimed at the US campaign. And I don't think that Trump would be, even Trump who loves Putin, there's no way Putin could play a role in this. If this would go forward, it would be either because there's concrete evidence, in which case it would be the US and Europe together, or it would be a political issue for the campaign. And I don't see Russia having a role. But maybe that's taking us away from what questioners wanted to ask.
I think Sandy wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I agree basically with Trudy here. At the end of the day, Putin really can't deliver that much for the Chinese. Now, if the US gets into a real sharp confrontation over the origins of the virus or further trade tariffs, there'll be all kinds of things. In fact, Biden and Trump may be competing to be tougher on China. But at the end of the day, Russia doesn't have that much to do to help China. It might help in terms of political isolation, deflecting some of the pressure on China. But at the end of the day, China is the rising superpower here that has all kinds of international ambitions. The secrecy that it is guilty of in the early weeks of the crisis are going to be a stain that's going to be hard for China to erase. But they've got the Belt and Road Initiative and other forms of assistance that they can provide to countries in helping them get out of the coronavirus crisis. I think China is going to be a real player, and Russia's very much the junior partner in this alliance with very little leverage. And on the sanctions, there's no way that Congress is going to let Trump have any freedom of maneuver. That's why Putin's gambit at the UN Security Council was a total bust. Trump, he may like Putin, but he's not prepared to do him any favors that would get him into a real, as we say, pissing contest with the Congress.
So I want to build on that and ask a question from the Q&A about Putin's disinformation efforts and U.S.-Russian relations. One way to read this, and some of this goes back to something a few of you commented on in your introductory remarks. But one way to think about this would be Russia itself is weakened and forced to focus on COVID, and so thus maybe can play relatively less of a role in trying to influence the American election. However, one thinks they would try to do that. Another way to think about it might be that Putin sees a divided America, and this is in America focused on COVID rather than Russia, so sees this as an opportunity to ramp up disinformation efforts in the general election campaign? You know, Sandy, maybe we can start with you and go around.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, his game is to exacerbate divisions. He may not think he has direct leverage over the outcome of the election, but
No.
creating difficulty maybe something he's tempted to do. But I think he's going to be sort of overly preoccupied with managing the COVID crisis in Russia itself. It's going to be increasingly forcing him to make the kinds of decisions that he's been avoiding in terms of more relief to the population, and potentially even looking to Europe or others for assistance in coping when the Russian healthcare system melts down. So he may, in fact, have reasons relating to the COVID crisis to kind of ratchet back the anti-Western propaganda and disinformation. I wouldn't reward him for that, but we certainly should encourage him to move in that direction.
Trudy or Evgenia?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be such an ugly election, and the divisions are already so clear. I was just writing a column on World Freedom of the Press Day on Sunday, in which President Trump tweeted, you know, enemies of the people, fake news. And I was looking at a Pew Research Center poll, which shows that Republicans mainly trust only a tiny handful of news outlets. You can guess Fox News pundits, a couple of others. So the electorate is so split, and all Russia has to do is play on US divisions. It's such a cheap hit. You know, you look at what is ugly. There's going to be a lot of racism, both on the surface and subliminal. There's going to be gender issues. You know, all Russia has to do is just tweet them out. You could imagine the scenario, and it hardly takes any money at all. You know, I was at the Internet Research Agency. I couldn't get in last year, and it's an amateur outfit. So of course they'll meddle, and China will, but not in the same way. China promotes itself as a better system than the US. Russia promotes the idea that the US is failing, inept, hates blacks, hates whites. You just play the game against the middle.
Suji, to be honest with you, I really think that you don't need Russia in order to have polarized elections.
Exactly.
Recently, there were unrest in Lansing. There were, protests, not unrest, of course, protests in Lansing, Michigan, and people came into the local legislature with
guns.
With guns and with all kind of racist slogans. So exactly. I think that it's really not helpful. To be honest with you, I'm very interested in American politics. And I'm the one who is watching Chris Wallace on Sundays as much as I, on Fox News, as much as I watch Face the Nation on CBS and This Week on ABC. And unless you see different sides of the game, you really have hard time understanding what's going on in the domestic politics here in the United States. I know you guys, you don't like when foreigners criticize your domestic politics, but I should say that all the research shows that divide in the American politics comes not because Russians did something. Yes, Russians did use Facebook, Russians did use Twitter, and by now we're pretty much aware the kind of tricks that Russians, Kremlin hackers used during the 2016 elections and will use during these elections, and did use in the past, as Soviet Union used during the Andropov's time times when, Reagan ran for the second term. So it's not something new. You already know about this. But the division of, this split in American politics comes out not because of Russia, but
No, I
because
agree
of
with you.
internal domestic problems. And, there is this great book by Levitsky et al., How Democracy Dies. It clearly shows that the division of, that's all was started by Gingrich and Republican right and Tea Party, which basically polarized the American polls to the extent when both two sides are unable to talk to each other. So I really think that it's not healthy to pinpoint Russia in that respect. There will be very dirty elections, but
No, I totally agree with you. And I have argued for a long time that the same point. However, Putin is expert at poking at wounds and just making things more ugly at the margins.
I think
But
that
it's
Putin will be so preoccupied with the situation in Russia. Putin is that afraid to deplete Russia's reserves, whether hard currency reserves or national or federal budget reserves, because he's afraid of politically motivated credits. He does remember the end of the Soviet Union. He does understand that that any loans from the West will be politically motivated. He's afraid of that. He expects all countries on the world to do something against him personally. He's paranoid. He's pretty much not in control anymore. He's very much, there is much more powerful institutional body, this Russian Security Council, who's basically calls the shots. So Putin is basically getting in the period of survival game. For him, it's really about personal survival. So I think that 2020 US elections will be the least on his agenda, to be honest with you.
So we've got time for one more question, and normally what I've been asking people in this COVID set of events is to tell me something positive, but I want to frame it maybe slightly differently and ask for a forecast from each of you, which is that one of the things we talked about at the beginning and then sort of danced around a little bit is sort of Russia's actual response to COVID and how effective we'll look back and sort of see it as being in say in a year from now or 2 years from now. I mean, there are, for a non-expert like me, there are troubling, things you read in the media about like doctors being thrown out of windows, like those sorts of things. Like those don't look like good signs from the outside, but I'm not an expert. We have 3 experts here. So here's my question. 18 months from now, will we think of Russia as one of the more successful countries in responding to COVID, or as one of the less successful countries? And how bad will it get if you think less successful?
I'll go first, I guess. I think we will see Russia as one of the least successful. They'll probably kind of muddle through to the point that the numbers of deaths begins to taper off, and maybe Putin will even survive politically, despite some of the worst case scenarios that are probably going through his mind right now. But I think this will expose both the political and institutional weaknesses of the Putin system, which is optimized to increase the wealth of the elite, but not optimized to deliver the welfare of its citizenry. And so it may take some time, there'll be a lag, but it may ultimately force political change in Russia. It may make Putin less welcome as leader for life, even if he serves out the remainder of his 4 years as president. But I think the bigger question is, where will the United States rank in that regard? And there I'm, believe it or not, a teeny bit hopeful that what we're seeing now in terms of the states beginning to kind of grasp the reins of the response, taking advantage of what is a federal system, basically giving up on the central government delivering the kind of coherent national strategy that we've been hoping for since this crisis began. And that, you know, America's capacity for self-correction, after screwing up at the beginning and trying all the alternatives that don't work, we may begin to finally, thanks to our federal system, get a grip on this and maybe join the ranks of some of the other democracies like Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, who have shown that democracies, if they get their act together, follow the science, are able to at least cope with a crisis of this kind and mitigate the human costs. I wouldn't say the US will be the first, but hopefully our performance will improve as the states take the reins.
Trudy or Evgenia?
Yeah, I mean, I would second Sandy on saying that I think it will be one of the lesser successful. I think it will be hard to really know because a lot of what may happen as the disease spikes in Russia will happen outside of Moscow. And you may never know the figures because it will be impossible to see, although some stuff may leak out. But doctors who have tried to talk out have been arrested, and others, as was mentioned, have suddenly taken flying leaps out of windows. So I think what will be more indicative will be whether Putin is forced to spend down on the rainy day fund and how Russia stumbles through what is going to be a terrific economic crisis because low oil prices will last. I would like to be optimistic about the US ranking in dealing with it. Clearly, there is tremendous innovation at the grassroots, which makes you think of the America that we all love. And whether that can compensate for lack of leadership at the top, we will see.
Evgenia, why don't you take us home?
You know, I'm a citizen of Russian Federation. I never was a supporter of Putin's and never voted even once for him and never will. But I always prefer to be loyal to my flag. And I hate to wish to think that Russia are going to be not successful in this war with COVID-19, because it's about my fellow citizens, because it's about my friends and my country as a whole. I hate to think that thousands and thousands of Russians will be dead. My brother-in-law was one of the first victims of the COVID-19. Russian health system obviously is not prepared as well as the system was prepared in Germany or even in the United States. However, we see that, for instance, East European countries like Poland, like Slovakia, Slovenia, they did pretty well. They were dead afraid about the inability of their health systems to carry out the task. That's why they closed their countries earlier than many other European countries, and they did pretty well. They have much less dead citizens than many other countries. I do think that the situation in Moscow and in St. Peter is going to be very bad. It's already bad and it will go even worse. In Moscow, they are building temporary hospitals in the exhibitions and in concert halls and in other places, like it was done in New York City when the temporary hospital was built in the Central Park. So it's going to be pretty bad. but I wish my country luck, because that's, and you know, we are the nation of survivors. We know how to survive. These are our basic skill. So I just hope that these skill that we inherited from our grandfathers and grandfathers will help my fellow citizens to survive this unfortunate situation once again. So I just hope that we are going to survive.
I'm very sorry to hear about your brother-in-law, and I hope everybody's families are safe and healthy and doing the best they can in these very difficult times. Yes, Andy?
You know, I hope the Russian people survive this one as they have in the past as well. This is ultimately a human issue, been overly politicized by many players in all countries. Well, let's hope that we can deal with the human consequences and find a way to strengthen our societies in the process.
Yes, I will just add that it would be lovely if this were the old days when scientists of every country were rushing to get together to work on the vaccine. Scientists of a lot of countries are rushing to get together. The United States officially is not joining with the larger group, but at least there's a tremendous amount of global cooperation going on below the official US levels. So I hope between everyone's best efforts, we'll find that vaccine and it'll work for everyone.
Yeah.
We can all hope, and with that, I hope we had over about 250 people signed in for the event today. We got to a lot of questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours. I hope you all will join me in thanking our tremendous panelists, or virtually thanking our tremendous panelists for doing an amazing job today. I would really appreciate it. I learned a ton about Russia's response to COVID and sort of what this means. And we hope that you will all join us next week, next Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Our next event in this series will feature Coco Warner, a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. She served as the manager of the Climate Impacts, Vulnerability, and Risk subprogram of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2016. And she's going to be talking about flattening the climate curve in the age of COVID-19. Hope everyone will join us for that event, and that everybody stays safe and okay. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.